3 in 4 businesses believe that if they don't scale AI in the next 5 years, they risk going out of business. But despite that hype, many organizations struggle to know how to really take advantage of the technology. So our next conversation is going to consider the kind of business transformation that is required if businesses are going to adopt AI responsibly. So please join me in welcoming to the stage John Thornhill, Innovation Editor of the Financial Times, who will introduce our panel.
Well, good afternoon and welcome. And if I could have my panel on the stage.
Now I'm confused.
We know where we're sitting.
I thought I knew where I was supposed to sit.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very great to be at this event today and to discuss this amazingly interesting subject with 3 great speakers. We heard a bit in the earlier session about some of the kind of big issues about AI, and I want in this one to drill more into kind of how AI is being applied in real life and what we ought to be thinking about and what it all means for us. We're joined by 3 great speakers on the stage. On my immediate right is Marc Warner, who's the Chief Executive of Faculty, an AI startup which is involved in a very varied real-world applications of AI. We have Shaheen Syed, who is the Chief Executive Officer for UK of Accenture, and Carissa Véliz, who is Associate Professor working on AI ethics at Oxford University. Now, I've been reading a book on AI by a Stanford professor called Fei Li called The Worlds I See, in which she describes how AI has gone from being a somewhat academic field which drew little attention into a commercial and cultural phenomenon, almost a force of nature. And she talks about it, how it's gone from being in vitro to in vivo, from going from the lab to the real world. And that's really what I'd like to explore today, how it is being applied in the real world. We know that 100 million people have experimented with ChatGPT within the past 2 months, within 2 months of its launch last November, and AI has had a breakout sector. It's become the hot investment sector. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta, and Apple are arguably the richest and most powerful companies in human history. They're all pouring billions of dollars into this technology and trying to reinvent themselves as AI-first companies. And this year, venture capitalists have invested $21.5 billion into AI companies globally, compared with about $5.1 billion in all of last year. But Vinod Khosla was saying today in the Financial Times, a big VC investor and a backer of OpenAI, that most investments in AI today, venture investments, will lose money. So to try to make sense of all this, we are joined by these 3 speakers. And I'm going to start with you, Shaheen. Yes. You work with a whole variety of organizations who are trying to apply AI in real life. Can you tell us how they're getting on?
Hello, everyone. So delighted to be here today. Look, there's a couple of things. I think we are still at the point in industry where we are seeing proof of concepts. The scaled production, sort of what I would call the productionized versions of these technologies, are starting to come into effect, but are still relatively nascent. What we are seeing is the proliferation of investment, as you talked about, the appetite to be educated on it and to understand what it really means in the context of your business strategy. We're seeing very strategic conversations with our clients about how to apply it in the enterprise, and I think customer contact centers, very good example of that. Insurance, another great example of really taking it and making it real. So we are seeing some specific segments of industry and functions within enterprises doing incredibly well at the speed of adoption and really trying to understand the stuff. And then we are seeing, some organizations across the world who are still struggling with data strategies, the basic stuff that you would consider to be the enablers, what we would call the digital core. Still a number of organizations that are talking about how to get onto the cloud. So you've got to have these enablement points. We would see cloud as the enabler, data as the kind of driver, and Gen AI as the true differentiator, as being the core components of how you actually get to applying this stuff at scale. And we've got lots and lots of industries and clients on different journeys at the moment, still trying to understand how to get through that process, but an absolute appetite and ambition to make this work, and in a responsible way, which I'm sure we're going to come back to. I know it's one of the things that you
How
want to
high a
talk about.
priority is it for boardrooms at the moment compared with everything else?
Absolutely huge and high. So the conversation in the boardrooms has been very much dominated, I would say, and I'm interested to see what the panel say, in the last sort of 8 months around this space. And it was almost a kind of post-pandemic moment of people understanding how fast technology could move, understanding the caution in that, as well as the opportunity. And I think as part of that moment, and I think it was a big inflection moment for the world, actually, AI found its way into the digital pantheon. And because of that, and because of people's understanding, specifically of ChatGPT, actually, it did a really interesting thing. I think it was the blink point, it did the trigger point for a number of companies. So I think organizations believe wholeheartedly that they have to get ahead of this, whatever ahead means. And again, I'm sure that's going to be a point of debate.
Go on.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to ask, do you think that it's more, there's more interest around this than digital transformation? Because it feels to me like companies have learnt the lesson from being slow on digital transformation and are now much more determined not to mess it up with AI.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think there's your point around pace and your point around getting to grips with it faster than, organizations probably did with digital transformation is at the heart of what the boardrooms are talking about right now. And I think it's an accessible conversation in a way that when you talk about cloud or platforms or, it's much harder to sort of conceptually get your head around how you apply that within your business, I think, for many organizations. And the ones that did it successfully were hugely tech conversant as businesses. This one is, and I don't want to take up room in terms of my space of speech, but this one is a really interesting one because I think it has a level of relatability to people in normal life that means that ability to translate and transport it over to business and industry becomes something that people find much, I wouldn't say easier to do, but smoother to do, with all of the perils that comes with that, which is the thing we'll come back to.
Great. That's a great kind of scene setter to set us off. Marc, I mean, you've been involved in AI for quite a time, and both as a kind of academic and now in trying to apply AI in a range of organizations as well. What are you most excited about? Where are its biggest opportunities, and what do you think people ought to be concerned about?
Well, I think the debate has become sort of lacks somewhat of nuance. So we've kind of partitioned into people who are sort of blindly optimistic and people who are sort of catastrophists. For us, we're most excited about safe, connected, human-first AI systems, as that means that they've been designed from the start to be narrow and focused on a specific task, and with safeguards built in from the very beginning. They're connected so that they're not only thought about in isolation. That's just a way to build deeper silos into organizations and to end up with lower performance as well, actually, because the context of the wider business matters for sales, matters for marketing. And then we're very strong proponents of human first. So you can think of this as sort of augmenting people's decision-making rather than trying to replace it. So for now, we certainly don't have anything that approximates a kind of human-level artificial intelligence. While that's true, hopefully it's true for a reasonably long time, the best decisions will be made by a combination of people and machines working together. But that doesn't come for free. You have to be very thoughtful about how you design the AI to support the person in making the better decision. So, obviously the work we did in COVID, when we helped the NHS predict how many patients were likely to turn up in hospitals across the country, was an example of that. There was no sense in which that was making the decision about where to send oxygen, where to send ventilators, where to move patients. But it was giving the commander of the COVID response, a guy called Keith Willett, an incredibly powerful set of information that he could then use to make those better decisions.
I mean, a lot of people who talk about AI and the application of it talk about it almost as a miraculous kind of productivity tool. It's going to help us to do so much more cheaply, faster, and so on. Is that right? Are you seeing real live examples of that?
Yes, but caveated that current AI technology is just another technology. It's ultimately better software. Actually, it's probably worth just outlining this distinction that I find useful. So, AI ranges on a spectrum from narrow to general. On the narrow side, we have things that are algorithms that are brilliant at chess. They can beat me at chess, but they can't put together a document. Over on the very general side, we have humans, without wanting to get into a technical debate over how general things can fundamentally be. Let's say that they can roughly optimize for their goals in a very wide set of environments. And so we are very focused on this narrow element. We think that is ultimately the best path to try and actually make these systems useful in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Carissa, I'd like to come to you. From a societal perspective, we're hearing about how AI is being applied in real life in companies and public organizations and so on. What do you think we ought to be excited about from a societal perspective, and what should we be concerned about?
Probably the same things. So it's so uncertain, and it's such a double-edged sword, like most technology, that in theory, we could have a lot more productivity. And in theory, for instance, that would free up time, among other things, to be better citizens, to be better informed, to have citizen assemblies, to have all kinds of practices that would improve democracy. But in practice, of course, that's far from guaranteed. And for instance, with productivity, I worry about many things. One is whether we will be globally more productive. So there are certain kind of technologies that make you more productive in one sense, but if you don't structure society in the right way, you will be less productive. So for instance, the washing machine is fantastic. My grandmother did not enjoy washing clothes, but I bet I spend much more time on email than my grandmother ever spent washing clothes. And it's much more unpleasant and much less embodied, and so on and so forth. So very often we hear things like, well, AI can do the boring jobs, and then you can do the creative jobs. But that's far from guaranteed, and we're seeing AI do very creative jobs, and then we're stuck doing what's it called? Or like email, or those kinds of administrative and very kind of drudgery. So we have to think about how AI affects power and power relations and power asymmetry. And one of the things we are seeing, which is quite concerning, is how powerful tech companies are in virtue of having these technologies, and how much we are dependent on them, from regular citizens to governments and anyone in between. So one example is how there's a company called Replica that is designing AI to be a companion, a kind of boyfriend or girlfriend. And people get hooked on their companion, and then the algorithm changes, and they feel like they lost a loved one. And similarly, when we trust an AI to do whatever, we lose skills in the process. So we're seeing, for instance, companies that are suffering ransomware, and suddenly they don't know how to govern the company in manual, analog way anymore. And sometimes they've had to call retired employees to help them manage the company. And what are we going to do when those retired employees are not there? So we have to think about how AI is changing power and making sure that the citizenry is empowered enough for democracy to stay healthy.
Just go on, Marc.
I think that's totally true, but a lot of those problems are problems of technology in general. So it is worth, I think, being a bit specific about exactly where AI differs from other technologies, like people retiring and old systems still running is a problem of software in general. Like that is a problem, but society does know how to manage it. I think the nuance that leads to the best answers is exactly what you were saying, but just finding the specifics of AI that make it slightly different from conventional, sort of more rules-based software.
Yeah, that's true. And I think there are at least two things that make AI a bit special. One is that we're trying to make it as general as possible, right? Sometimes failing, but we're trying. Yeah. And it's interesting how you phrased it, Marc. When you were talking at the beginning, you said AI is not general, and hopefully it won't be for a long time. And I think that makes sense. A lot of people don't want it to be general, and yet we're pushing for it. So it's a really quirky situation.
The we in that is complicated, but yeah.
And I was going to say, who do you think is pushing for it as well, Carissa? Because it's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, that's true. Mostly tech companies, but of course we're kind of on the same boat. So first of all, the more general it is and the more tasks it can do, then the more dependent we are. on any one company or any one algorithm rather than different companies for different little things. And then the second, which is very related, is its scale. So when you have one machine, if it stops working, then you kind of replace it, and the reach is quite bounded. But when you have an algorithm, and especially one algorithm that can be used by many companies, so the way algorithms work is very often they are millions of lines long, and new algorithms often are built on top of those old algorithms. And many companies might use parts of the same algorithm. And if there's an error in one of those main algorithms, it can have such systemic reach that we've never seen this before.
So you're worried about issues of kind of discrimination and bias, particularly in the hiring or the firing market and the labour market and so on, or where it comes to access to healthcare and so on. These are not issues that appear to be on the agenda very much at the Bletchley Park meeting on Wednesday and Thursday this week, are they? They're talking about the kind of big issues. Do you think there should be a refocusing on the kind of here and now concerns of AI?
Absolutely. I think we are focusing on concerns that are very convenient for big tech, because it means that they can focus on the far future and they don't have to change anything dramatically in the way they do things day to day, and they can kind of shrug off the kinds of harms that are already happening today. And it's interesting, I know a lot of people in this field, I know a lot of top researchers. None of the people I know have been invited to this AI Summit.
I hear this argument a lot, that it's neglecting a whole series of concerns over here, and this is what we ought to be talking about. But do you not think we have the capability to talk about the full spectrum of concerns, from the ones that you're talking about and the ones that the Bletchley Park are talking about? It's not necessarily binary, is it?
I agree. It's not necessarily binary, and we need to give each concern its due, based on how bad is the risk and how likely is the risk. But arguably, when harms are already here, is kind of a red flag to pay more attention to those, because it's not something hypothetical that might happen in 15 years' time. It's something that's happening already. And so when the discourse gets co-opted by this one concern that is coincidentally very convenient to big tech, then I think there's cause for concern.
All right, Marc?
Also, I don't know that I recognize that the discourse has been totally co-opted like that, as in, I don't think that for a bunch of the small issues that are undoubtedly, let's say domain-specific issues that are undoubtedly important, it's not obvious to me that there should be international agreement on what we do. Like, I think it's totally fine if the US takes its approach, if we take our approach, if other countries take their approach. And so I actually don't think that would be, those issues are best solved in an international forum. I think the questions that do need to be addressed internationally are these bigger questions of like, what happens if we generate very powerful algorithms that we start to lose control of. Those are international questions. And I don't think it's totally crazy that we should set aside 2 days out of the last, whatever it's been. I mean, so I was on the AI Council from 2017 or something like that. And the government has considered X risk relatively little over that time. So I don't know that I fully recognize the idea that this has somehow completely co-opted the debate. I think there's going to be a moment for this to be talked about. And then people will rightly go back to worrying about, okay, but how do we make sure that medical algorithms are safe? And how do we make sure that if we do use this stuff somewhere, then it's not biased?
Look, it's created a moment which means that the debate is being had differently in the world outside of Bletchley Park. Mm-hmm. Right, so just the fact that it is happening has created a new discourse, and people having very deliberate conversations about what does this mean in whichever segment of whichever industry. Net, that can only be a good thing. The polemics between kind of private sector and public sector, and sort of talking about the two things as separate things, and the guardrails don't work together, and actually they have to coexist. They don't have to coexist, they have to collaborate. More than ever, this is the point where we start to see the convergence, truly, of private sector and public sector. And public sector, has been, for years, the hotbed, especially in this country, of innovation, R&D, investment. We have some of the most, and Chris is one of them, some of the most brilliant academics and thinkers in the world where we are. And so this idea now of how do you bring this stuff together Because you can't rely on the regulation to the extent that people would want to based on the speed of what's happening with the technology anyway. We're going to have to iterate and do this thing differently in a way, in a new paradigm, right? We've never done this before with this level of technology that moves this fast. But that shouldn't be feared with the right people working together.
That all sounds great, but how do you respond to the kind of point that Carissa is making about the asymmetries of power? I can't think of any other kind of technology where we have had such a concentration of expertise in the hands of so few people. And that, I mean, when you look at the citations for AI research, 70% of the most cited AI papers over the past 3 years have come from US companies and institutions. And that's overwhelmingly dominated by the big companies rather than the universities. And a lot of universities are struggling to keep up with that kind of leading edge research that's going on in this area. So how, as a society, do we understand what is going on at the leading edge of this research and what its societal implications are, and if necessary, to regulate it or to control it or to ensure that the companies are held to account for how they use it?
Look, I'm really interested in what Marc and Carissa have to say on this. First of all, I think we need to stop treating academia as though it's the purview of to some extent, the elite. Actually, the language of what is coming out in the papers and many of the American papers that we've been reading is palatable and accessible to normal human beings, right? It's, can I even understand what you are saying? There is something about the language that is used in this debate and in this technology that I think many people feel is impenetrable. And some of that is academic language. So we need to find a way to break that stuff down into something that is just usable. I think to the point on the voice of people who are doing the work that a lot of this AI is going to affect, and Carissa and I were talking about it, is going to be one of the most dominant, I think, shifts in how this debate needs to be had. We're not really talking about people on the shop floor. We're not really talking about people that are in manufacturing and bringing them into the conversation on, okay, so we could use it like this, we could use it like this, but what is the right way to do this based on what you experience every single day in the role that you play? If academia is saying this in this paper and it talks about this peril, what does it really mean? It means nothing until you actually talk to people that are physically instantiating and doing the work in whichever areas of whichever industry. I mean, Carissa, what your perspective is on this, but that starts to break down the elitism that you refer to, which is power structures and knowledge is power, and actually this sense of let's call it, for want of a better word, the educated folks who understand this stuff and have got PhDs in maths, et cetera, being the people that can tell us about how we should be applying it. No, this has got to be an absolute conversation with people that we are working with day in, day out to understand what it means in their lives and in the work that they do.
So, Carissa, how do you take it out of the university seminar room and get it to be the discourse of politics?
There's so much to say about this. So one thing is, I think we should go beyond the debate about private industry versus public, because it matters like what the industry is and who they are. So I think one thing that we have to take into account that we've already experienced many times before from car safety onwards is that an industry cannot regulate itself. Yeah. It doesn't matter how good the people are or how well-intentioned, it doesn't matter who they are. It can't regulate itself. So that's the first thing to take into account. The second thing with academia is we should value academia because academics don't have an agenda. An academic is not going to be rich because AI succeeds or fails, or the typical academic, the paradigmatic academic. And one of the things I'm worried about, and maybe, Marc, this is what you're thinking when you're kind of gesturing, is more and more researchers are taking money from big tech. And that is very concerning because suddenly they don't have that independence anymore. But if we don't want them to do that, we need to fund academia. To the best of my knowledge, my institute is the only institute that does ethics of AI that hasn't taken money from big tech. And that's really concerning. And governments should make use of researchers who have this expertise and who are willing to help and try to share it. And what I'm seeing at the moment is that governments are not only accepting advice from big tech, but pretty much sometimes you listen to a discourse by a politician and you can't distinguish whether it's from a politician or from a CEO from a big tech company.
Marc, if I'm not wrong, you are a recovering academic. You teach at Harvard for a while, didn't you? So you know this world very well.
Yeah.
How do you respond to the points Carissa's making?
Yeah, so I certainly agree that we should fund academia to have the compute it needs to do the research. That seems absolutely true. I would just slightly question, I think of academia as a system filled with brilliant people, but it's still a system. And while academics might not get rich out of their work, they will get famous. And I think it's naive to think that that doesn't have its own complicated implications for how science is done. And we can get into enormous detail on how citations and the various funding frameworks and peer review lead to a particular type of science and not a broader type of science. So I agree with you in every sense, but I think of it as we need systems that are heterogeneous to keep a track on each other, rather than putting one system up as here's the Platonic philosophers and everyone else is down here. It's like we need like systems that mutually keep check on each other. One thing to add to this is I think society in general has to be very careful about the way it pushes the burden for deciding on ethical decisions onto technologists. So I've said this for a few years now. I think technologists, the safest way, the best way for society is that technologists are forced to apply the technologist responsibility. It should be to apply the ethics that civil society gives us. There is a bit of a trend to saying, well, you just need to figure out the right answer. So Facebook needs to be responsible for misinformation, things like this. I think that's a bad trend. I think we need to separate. It's like we, civil society, decide what's right, and you, technologists, have to implement that.
So it's in service.
On that note, I also wanted to add what Shaheen was saying and we were talking about before. The knowledge of workers is really important. And we tend to think about these people who are educated and people who are not educated, but that's actually false. So people who are workers in different industries have their own education and their own experience. And we need to know what it's like to work at a warehouse on Amazon and what it's like to drive a van in the gig economy. And one of the interesting things about history is that some of the best governments, arguably, that we've had, like governments both in the US and in the UK during the Second World War, were governments in which people were not highly educated, or they were not highly educated in the university term, but they were very experienced when it comes to everyday life and how the challenges that people are facing. So one of the interesting things we've seen recently is that the strike of writers in Hollywood, one of the interesting products of that was a deal that included how AI can and cannot be used. And I hope that we see more of that from different industries.
How do you see that working in industry, Shaheen? I mean, are companies consulting their employees a lot when they're adopting these systems? Is there a dialogue before they're put in place, and what the ethics and responsibilities?
They're very involved in the process. So if you think about what people used to call product squads or product teams, there's a very, very strong propensity, and it's really happening on the ground now with them working with people that do the jobs every single day. And that is being not just taken into account, it's being informed and influenced by it, which is where I think you're going to see patterns across all industries going forward. It's to what Carissa was talking about. It's the same modus operandi that we're going to need. So I can't see that you could be successful, actually, truly successful, with that amount of let's just keep calling it dialogue, for want of a better word. And some of the stuff that you hear from people that do the job day in and day out is just stuff that you're never going to see if you try and top-down implement a technology and say, look, what we have to do is take this business process end to end, then we simplify it, then we automate it, and then we put Gen AI on top of it. That is not the way to do it. That's the sort of automation thing that we used to do in the past when we talked about robotics and all of the rest of it. That has fundamentally changed in the mindset. So much of this, John, is going to be cultural. So much of it is going to be about leadership. So much of it is going to be about the desire to engage at that level to get the best possible outcome you can, not just for your customers, but actually for the people that work in your organisation.
Yep. So that's all very strong points I think you're making on that. Marc, I'd like to pick you up on something you were saying about it's up to society to say these are the ethics and we hand them over to the technologists. What does that mean in practice and how does that work? So, for example, I was interviewing Yoshua Bengio, one of the pioneers of deep learning, for a podcast, and he was making the case that we should have the equivalent of a kind of US Food and Drug Administration, at least for the very leading edge of AI research. In other words, you need to get algorithms pre-approved, as it were, to ensure that they are safe and are going to have good end uses. A lot of people in the tech industry hate that as an idea because it would involve a lot of cost and time and slow down leading-edge research. What do you think of an idea like that?
So I think basically I fundamentally roughly agree with him. I think it is important to make this distinction between narrow and general again, though.
Of course.
So that the best way to think about it is there are a set of algorithms that we understand really well and we can control really effectively. We should be getting those out into the world as fast as possible. Like the UK is facing fairly catastrophic prosperity crisis, roughly flatlined since 2008. This is going to be the first generation for 200 years that grows up poorer than its parents on average. That is really bad and going to have really bad consequences. If you look at the US, which hasn't had that, the growth has come from technology. And so I, looking around, can't see many places that prosperity is going to come from other than the tech companies that are building AI and the productivity improvements that AI brings. Now, I think that's fine because there are really safe control. I mean, AI has been used for decades, right? Deep learning was first deployed in the US Postal Service in 1989. So there are things that we understand really well and we can use very effectively. However, there are a set of algorithms that we don't understand and we can't control. And that boundary will move over time, but I do think we need to be extremely cautious about that. So my prescription, if I was in charge, would be to regulate these narrow AI applications in a domain-specific way, because I definitely don't think we should have the same restrictions on medical algorithms as we should on somebody choosing to put a red jumper or a blue jumper on the top of their website.
And that means just tweaking existing legislation or updating or modifying existing
in the most cases, I think it's tweaking regulation. I think there are certain circumstances where you can imagine that there are just sort of slightly fun, like maybe autonomous cars or something like that. There are some circumstances where is a bit more of a shift required, but it would be done domain-specifically by a domain-specific regulator. But I am one of the people that think there are no scientific reasons that we can give why a superintelligence should be safe. And there are no scientific reasons we can give that mean you shouldn't be, there's no reason that we can't build one. And so those two things in concert for me just then suggest that there's this area of caution.
Mm-hmm. Carissa, where do you set the regulatory barrier? Do you think that there is something so singular about AI that it deserves special regulatory institutions of their own? Or is it a question of modifying all of our existing laws and regulations to accommodate the potential dangers of AI?
I think both. And part of what is special about AI is not so much the technology, but the power. And we are seeing that regulatory agencies are being overpowered. Some of these individuals have more money than the regulatory agencies that they are dealing with. So in 2019, I wrote a paper at the Harvard Business Review in which I argued that we should have a kind of FDA of the United States for AI. So we need specialized agencies that have enough funding, that have the expertise to understand algorithms, and that not every algorithm has to be tested, but certainly medical algorithms or algorithms that are going to make very important decisions about people, like whether they're going to jail. And those have to be tested through randomized control trials. So it's incredible that we do that for medications, and even in a situation of emergency like COVID, we still were adamant that vaccines had to go through a process of randomized control trials, and yet pretty much anyone can do an algorithm to do pretty much anything, including jailing people, and they're not subject to enough safety or supervision, and that's incredible.
So there are domain-specific laws. Like if your algorithm is used in a medical context, there are certain circumstances where it gets classified as a medical device, and then you have to fulfill the same laws that a medical device would, including the randomized control trials and showing benefit. Now, I am no expert in this, so I don't want to overclaim, but there are definitely domain-specific laws that definitely capture algorithms already. Maybe those aren't enough. Maybe
they're not transparent enough as well. I think, Marc, in terms of people's understanding, it goes back to that point on what is cohesive to wider society, and that then goes back to a question about trust, right? Which is, you're talking about the tenets of civic life, you're talking about justice, you're talking about health, you're talking about common causal questions that we need to get the sectors around to describe and agree.
To be fair, I think we could look up in 5 minutes what the rules are.
I'll give you an example.
I get it, Marc. I get it. I think the point is making that something that is a part of everyday life in the conversations that we have has not yet been realised, right? For many of us it is, because it is part of our everyday life, but it's the point around how do you make sure that that is something that is genuinely understood by the wider world.
I'll give you a clear example to see how insufficient that legislation is. So during COVID, while the vaccines were undergoing randomized control trials, there were about 100 plus AI tools that were used in hospitals to try to diagnose and treat COVID. 2 years later, there were 2 meta-analyses done about those tools. And out of 100 plus, only 1 turned out to have maybe some clinical significance. All the others either didn't have any clinical significance whatsoever, or they were actually harmful. And patients were exposed to these tools. So it wasn't like the vaccines that were already figured out to be safe. And so that just shows how insufficient it is.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't quite buy that at least in the UK, algorithms like for medical diagnosis were let to get to patients before they got trialed. Like, I've never seen that.
All right, I'm going to open this up to the audience questions in just a minute. But before I do that, one final kind of question from me on kind of tech for good. We've talked a lot about the concerns that we have about AI. But as Marc, you were saying, you know, we are facing a productivity crisis in this country and many other countries in the world. AI can help enable great kind of productivity gains in different fields. How do we establish the framework for tech for good? Shaheen, do you want to start on this? What do we need to do to maximise its benefits?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I'm a huge advocate for what AI is going to do in the world of edtech in particular. It goes back to that point around tenets of civic life and what is important. I think we have, I'll come back to the point on governance, and I'm sure Marc and Carissa will talk about that as well. There is something here that is as yet, I think, unleveraged to the extent that it could be. And we talk about, and I don't mean to be Pollyanna or kind of tech optimist about it, but we talk about tech, you know, we have talked about tech in the past being one of the last great equalizers if used correctly. And I think education is going to be one of the areas that we could see that proliferate in a way that we've never seen before, both in terms of what it does for teachers and where they focus their time. And I don't mean that in terms of productivity and efficiency, I just mean that in terms of how they work and help their students differently based on the tasks that they have. I have many sort of very close friends that are teachers. And also students, right? Because I think the education systems across the world have still enacted a one-to-many type service in terms of the way that people learn. And I think if we get this right, we're going to be into very, what I would call personalised learning in a way that we've never seen before, which I think fundamentally could change the stakes for kids that don't have the access that they should have, because it's a basic human right. So I feel very strongly about this one in particular, and I think it needs to go faster, for sure.
As it happens, my wife is a maths teacher, and she used to be an engineer and a computer scientist. Yeah. And her experience is that very often edtech companies will come along and say, this is the solution. This is how we're going to revolutionize education. And they've never been anywhere near a classroom. But she's a great believer in the fact that you can use these technological tools to start with a problem in the classroom and then enable you to teach better.
We happen to be doing a hackathon today and tomorrow with DFE, including students and teachers, and trying to help exactly this, marry up the people who actually understand what's going on, which not exclusively, but generally one group of people with the people who are most familiar with the technology, and see what comes out of that.
Mm-hmm. So you start with a specific problem rather than applying a generalized solution.
Exactly.
Carissa, what do you make of this debate? How do we maximize the good of AI?
I think if we invested even just a quarter of what we invest in AI, in governing AI and AI ethics, I would be much more optimistic about using AI for good. Governments need to regulate. a lot of people are talking about not rushing to regulate AI, but of course we are rushing to implement AI and to expose citizens to those risks. And taking into account that ethics has to be there by design, it's not something that you can add on years later once the technology has been designed and kind of implemented. So I would like to see more of that at every level, including funding. So recently the European Union has implemented some requirements, ethical requirements for companies doing AI, and I would like to see that also from venture capitalists, because if not, we will never see companies taking AI ethics seriously and from the start. And then finally, just cherishing and cultivating the rule of law. So I worry about how we are implementing AI in ways that make us subject to rules that we don't even know what the rules are. So we know that we are being judged by these algorithms, we know we have to kind of defend ourselves in that way, but we don't know what the rule is and nobody can explain it to us. And that's really the definition of something being Kafkaesque, essentially.
We've all talked very loosely about the term ethics on this panel, but the question is whose ethics should be built into these systems? I mean, who has the right to determine what ethical framework should be adopted? And I mean, as you're saying, that's one of the consequences of the asymmetries of power, that it tends to be kind of rich, powerful people who get to determine the ethical frameworks of that, and a lot of people in the world are just not going to have any input into that at all. How do we resolve that issue?
Partly through giving voice to people like workers, and maybe there is a new kind of need for workers to come together in different ways to be able to have their voice heard. And it's a tricky balance between, because at the same time, we don't want ethics to be crowdsourced, right? So we have to take into account, especially the voices of the people who might lose out.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else on that?
I mean, I would point to democracy as exactly ethics being crowdsourced. And I think I agree that, basically a more robust government control over these things, or a very thoughtful government interventions on these things. So again, I'm always going to, I think where it's safe, where we can control it, we should go as fast as possible. Like, it's worth bearing in mind that in circumstances where you don't do that, kids have worse educations, people die in hospitals. Like, there are very, very real downsides to having good technologies that are safe, that we can control, that we don't implement. But I am not one of the blind optimists that just says, therefore we should go as fast as we possibly can. I think that is like a kind of logical fallacy. There is a really clearly demarcated space where we can go very fast, and a very clearly demarcated space where we should go like relatively cautiously.
Great. Questions from the audience? Who would like to ask a question? Let's see. Stunned everyone into silence.
There's a couple up there.
There's
loads at the back.
It's just on that side here, please.
Hi, my name is Dahlia. I'm from the Design Museum. Could you elaborate a bit more about how we're using AI to jail people? Is that artificial intelligence picking people out in a crowd? Because I've never heard that, actually.
Carissa.
Well, there's a few ways. So one is AI is being used for policing often. So this is more in the US. There's been famous cases, first with an algorithm called predpol that predicts where crime might happen, and so there's more policing there, but then there's more arrests there, and that's the way it starts. But then there's another algorithm called Compass that helps assess risk, and that it gets factored into whether somebody gets bailed or sentencing decisions. In the UK, we've seen the use of facial recognition sometimes in crowds to identify suspects, and that's been very controversial. So we are seeing involvement. Also in Europe, there have been cases in which the police turns out to use algorithms. And one of the problems is that often we're not sure what algorithms are being used and why. And sometimes police are getting access to private algorithms independently. So it's not like a government-based decision, but it's rather that, for instance, Amazon approaches a police station and kind of offers them these kind of system and they accept, and so it gets really complicated to stay on top of it at the moment.
I think in particular, one of the cases you're talking about, the kind of compass system in America, where it was used to recommend jail sentences or bail decisions, wasn't it? That for commercial reasons, the company that had developed it refused to say how their algorithm was written, what were the inputs into that algorithm. So it was, in that sense, not contestable in any way, which struck many people as a terrible idea, and that particularly the people at jail, because they had no way of contesting the decision that had been taken by a black box algorithm. Is that the kind of core of the problem, do you think?
That is one of the problems. But another problem is whether, so some people think that the justice system is particularly important to have peers, because what it means to be judged by a peer is something morally different than what it means to be judged by an algorithm, and whether we might have our rights to a human decision in certain contexts, and particularly in justice. This is a point of debate.
Okay.
Can I just one tiny point? Like, it is worth just distinguishing, and Carissa, you wouldn't disagree with this, but it is worth distinguishing algorithms from AI. So an algorithm can be a very simple set of processes, and so we use algorithms normally are used by people all the time in medicine. They say if somebody is below 50 and is presenting with these symptoms and is this and is that, then this should be the treatment. And so while all AI is algorithms, not all algorithms are AI. And that is just in these complicated, very political questions, it's worth just unpacking slightly exactly what did that mean. Why was it an algorithm? Was it AI? How you know?
That's a very good corrective. And I think David Spiegelhalter, who studied that whole campus case, found that in fact it was basically a kind of checkbox system that you could have done on an Excel spreadsheet. It wasn't really anything to do with machine learning. So yes, there's a question at the back, and then over there.
Okay. Hi, really interesting conversation today, so thank you for this. I guess what I wanted to kind of ask was relating to standards, because I do a lot of work, for example, as part of the AI committee at the British Standards Institute and the International Standards Organization. And I think that's a valuable way for people in all different fields to feed into this debate and to structure policy, I guess, around how they feel and how they work. And so I think one of the things I've noticed, though, in these standards organizations is that it's largely big tech that put people forward for that and have people dedicated to shaping these standards. And I wonder if you have any ideas about how we could get more SMEs, for example, involved in the structuring of these standards, which then go on to shape policy.
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with funding. So for instance, when I get invited to advise the European Commission or the UK government, I have to take time out of my job, which is costly for me. And then I go there, and many of the people with whom I'm sharing a panel are people who are being paid a fortune to defend the interests of big tech. So it's really an uphill battle. And if we value other people getting input into these regulations, then we have to fund them.
Yeah, it's really hard as a small organizations. I mean, faculty is now probably a medium-sized organization. But back when we were tiny, you're totally right, we just didn't have the time to go to.
But if it was mandated that we needed to do it, I know what you're going to say. I know what you're going to say.
Mandating that our startups have to go and spend their time on this.
But with the funding, but with a conversation that is different than it is today, Mark, that there's got to be a break point. There's got to be a break point, because otherwise, to the point, it's going to continue as is.
So you have to give them something valuable. So if you could connect, if you could say that these conversations were somehow going to, if it was a networking opportunity for them, if it was also valuable in some other way, they might go for it.
And there are associations that normally represent startups as well. You might. There's a question over there.
That's a way better idea. VC should fund those associations. That is how that should work. It's probably the easiest way.
So the AI hype cycle is sort of coming after the Web3 hype cycle, which a lot of investors sort of see as a dud or a technology that's a solution still in search of a problem. How do you, to all the panel, is the AI hype cycle different? Is it unique in any way? Or is it similar to previous hype cycles? And do you have a view on how it might end and who the winners and losers will be?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
So I think that there is more fundamental reality to AI. So faculty's been working on AI for 10 years. I was a physicist by background, so I did quantum computing most recently at Harvard, and decided that AI was going to be the most important technology of our time from a scientific perspective and an impact perspective. And for about 9.5 years, I'd say that to people, AI is going to be the most important technology of our time, and they would look at me slightly weirdly. The last 6 months, it seems like more and more people are agreeing. I think it is you can just look at the step up in capabilities of the things computers are able to do to convince yourself that there is some underlying reality there. However, like anything fashionable in human society, once something works, a bunch of extra people are going to pile on it. The same people who were crypto experts and metaverse experts 2 years ago and then 1 year ago are now going to be AI experts. And that is, if the fundamental reality should do something like this, I don't know, some slope like this, we'll get onto a slope that will be above that because of that, and we'll just get this natural bubble dynamic that will overhype it, and there'll be some correction. I think that's inevitable. I don't know who the winners are going to be. Now, I'm sort of fingers crossed faculty does all right. But it is really hard. In a technology that's developing so fast and in such profound ways, nobody can tell you for sure who the winners and losers are going to be.
Shaheen, what do you think about this? I mean, there's a very interesting argument, I think, whether it will be the incumbents or the insurgents who are going to exploit this technology best commercially. A lot of the incumbent companies obviously have a lot of data. They have the access to capital. They've got a brand. They've got expertise and so on. But there are a lot of startups who are taking this technology and creating new business models from scratch.
Yeah.
Who is going to prevail in this world?
Oh, and they're unfettered, which gives them speed, which relates to the point on the propensity and the proliferation of what is happening here. And I think they will do incredibly well. I think they will do incredibly well as part of ecosystems. I don't think this is a kind of either-or situation. I think it's very much predicated on what particular industry you're working in and what their estate is, actually, and what their enterprise feels and looks like. And I think we do this universal thing about it, which is just, it's not the same for most organizations. To the point on hype, it's a really interesting one. I was one of those 26 years ago people that started when the internet felt new. Yeah, we were the people that kind of dialed in with the modem and then waited 25 minutes for our emails to come through and it used to go beep, beep, beep. We were that generation. And then it was platforms with all of the ERP cycle and SAP and Oracle and all of the rest of it. And honestly, having experienced it in mainframe, and I was a coder, I used to code C++ when I started many years ago and tested it for many years too. You think about these kind of S-curves that have occurred in technology, and I honestly mean this. It's like AI was the bit that the S-curves were waiting for. Does that make sense? So it's like the arrival point that gives you the insight on top of everything that you've been building to at this point, right? The cloud was the next major one. So these were all the enabling factors that then led to this point where the insight and the decision-making and the precision of that, using Gen AI in particular, has become probably one of the most significant things I have seen in a career of being a technologist for 26 years. So I think we have to take this incredibly seriously as a, to your point, there'll be an equalization, it will do an interesting thing as part of the curve, right? The wave will start to subside at some point and we'll think about it very differently, but not now. And I don't think for the next few years, actually. I think this is all my prediction, right? So I take it as you will. But I really believe that this isn't the kind of circus that we've seen before in many different constituent parts of tech. This one feels real right now. The question is how we handle the speed. The question is, back to that point on the ethics, how we handle the ethics. And I think some of the winners will be the people that really understand the ethical way to implement and operationalize this stuff. If there was ever a moment to start thinking about society differently, and I think this is a critical point. It's this moment. Because, this point you and I talked about, John, around bias and all of the stuff that kind of keeps raising its head. It's not like we're not dealing with bias right now. Actually, I think AI holds the mirror up to the bias in a very particular way. which is you've been dealing with this all your life, haven't you? Haven't we? That's the truth of what's really happening. All it's doing is going, here's your orthodoxy. Now, what are you going to do to treat this with me differently? Because I probably have a way to get through this in a manner that you have never experienced. With an amount of human intervention, we need to stop treating it as though AI is the thing that will virally go off into a world of science fiction. I know it feels like that in something, but we need to rein it back in terms of the practical application of it, with people being at the centre of this debate. And like I said, I think those people, wherever they are from, are actually going to be the winners in how this thing plays through.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze in one final.
Thank you very much.
Oh, just down here. In fact, I'm going to take two questions. You have a question too. So could we have this one and then get the mic to the gentleman on the right here as well?
Morning, I'm Gopal Ramcharan, I'm CEO of Responsible AI UK Professor at Southampton University. Thank you to our panelists for a great discussion. Just want to ask a question to Shaheen and Marc in particular, and think a bit about how you're advising your clients on the use of certain technologies, for example, GPT from OpenAI. And Marc mentioned, he likes AI to be human first. So how do you navigate this when, first, do you believe that tools like GPT are designed to be human first? Do you think it is an ethical tool? And whether you do or not, how do you help your clients navigate the ethics of such tools as they are being promoted as part of the hype?
Can you log that? And we'll just have a final question from down here.
Yeah, so I'd like to hear about our panelists' vision for the future. We seem to be hearing about technology shaping our future, but what do we want for our children? And then surely we build technology to infrastructure that. So where do you want the world to be in 20 years' time for your children or grandchildren or carers or wherever?
Okay, so Shaheen and Marc, could you answer the first question, and I'll leave it to Carissa to have the final word in answering the last one.
So I think that, like any tool, something like ChatGPT or Llama 2 or whatever, let's broadly make it about LLMs, can be put to ethical or unethical uses. So it's a tool like any other. And actually the thing that determines the ethics is the problem you put it to and the approach you take to solving that problem. And so I didn't go into enormous amounts of detail about it here, but whenever we use an LLM in the context of our work, let me talk about the bad approach first. So the bad approach is, let's just dump a load of text into the LLM, let's dump a problem in, and then have it give us the answer. Right? It's very uncontrolled, it's uninterpretable. It seems like that is not a human-first way of doing it. Our approach to a similar problem would be to unpack, to decide, I don't want to take up too much time, so I won't go into specifics, but basically to modularize the problem, so to say, okay, so we're getting this text data in, then we're going to summarize it in this way, so that's one module, and then we're going to put policies around each of these individual modules so that they can or can't do certain things. We're going to check bias, privacy, whatever, and separate out the goals from the interpretation of the text, and build a safe, connected, human-first system. And so I think in that way, you actually give yourself the opportunity to move away from, steel can be used for girders, it can be used for knives. Thinking of a tool as either fundamentally ethical or unethical, when it's not AGI. At that point, I think maybe the discussion changes, but pre-AGI, I think is this, you can, anyway,
okay.
It's better approach.
I'm sorry, we're very short of time, so sorry, Shaheen, could I just get Carissa to, in 1 minute, explain what the world's going to look like in 20 years' time?
So you do that, Carissa.
What I would like it to look like, and this is partly what I tell my clients when I do consulting, is first of all to imagine that to not create your own risk. We tend to think about risk as something external, but very often we are our biggest risk when we use data in ways that are irresponsible, when we create an AI that we then can't control. Secondly, to think that to think about ethics as a competitive advantage. I really invite companies to see it as like, people are thirsty for this. They want to be able to trust the company. And the company who manages to use AI in a way that is completely trustworthy is going to win this race. And then final, maybe 2 points, is to protect democracy. One of the things I've argued in my book, Privacy is Power, is that we should ban the trade in personal data because it's very toxic for our democracy and our elections. And then final point is we should also cherish the analog world. Of course there's a place for the digital, of course it's important, but we are sometimes neglecting the analog world to our own peril and forgetting that any digital world depends on the natural world, whether it is the world of things and our relationships to people, our relationships to local communities and to physical spaces and to nature. Let's not forget the analog in this very kind of digitalized world.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end this discussion, but thank you very much to Carissa and to Shaheen and to Marc. Thank you.